Now that my bright side quilt is all pieced, it's time to dive into the Bliss quilt along. Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca, and in today's video, we're gonna do block number 1 for the Bliss quilt along. This is a wonderful block of the month program that is included for free in your sew sampler boxes starting in April 2022 and ending in March 2023. But don't worry, if you don't get the sew sampler box from Fat Quarter Shop, you can still purchase these patterns for just under $5 a piece and do this sew along from your stash with me. I will be releasing videos 1 through 4 every Saturday at 9 a.m. in the month of August. And then starting in September, on the first Saturday of every month, I will release the block that was in the previous month's sew sampler box. So you'll want to make sure that you're subscribed to this channel. You have that little bell turned on so that you're getting notifications. That way you can keep up with each of these video tutorials as we progress through the quilt top. As a reminder, this is not my pattern, so I can't give you cutting instructions. So as a result, what I've done is starched, cut, and labeled all of my fabric according to the pattern for block 1. If you haven't done that yet, pause the video here, go do that, and come right back. Don't worry, I'll wait for you. Are you guys ready? Let's go. This is the block that we're going to make this month, and there are a ton of half square triangle units. Like literally, it's a half square triangle unit in the middle with half square triangle units all around a half square triangle unit. So one of the ways that can make this very easy is to use some of that half square triangle paper that Fat Quarter Shop sells. They did include a small roll of that with my quilt kit, but I don't know where I set it. So I'm going to use the 2 at a time method just like I always do. The 2 at a time method is going to take our fabric A and our fabric B squares, and we're going to draw a line on the back side of our fabric A squares from corner to corner. We're going to use that line to guide us when we're sewing. We're going to stitch just under a 1/4 inch on either side of that line when we have fabric A and fabric B put right sides together and taken to our sewing machine. So let's get drawing. To draw my lines, I am actually using an air-soluble pen. This is different than I normally use. Most of the time I use a water-soluble marker, but a friend gifted me a couple of these air-soluble markers. The marking from this marker stays on the fabric for just a couple of days, but eventually just disappears completely over time. And then of course, once you wash it, all of the chemicals actually come out of your fabric entirely. So this is safe to use on your fabric when you're marking lines like I'm doing on the backside, or maybe if you just wanted to help give yourself some diagrams for how you're going to quilt something. What I like about this marker above the water-soluble marker is that there's no extra step required to make those lines come away, but it still stays there even after applying heat. So if I needed to mark a quilt top with this air-soluble marker to show how I want to quilt something or just to make notes for myself, I can do that. I can still press my project and my marking references should still be there. Now that I have the lines drawn on the back side of all of my fabric A squares, I'm going to take one fabric A and one fabric B. I'm going to put those right sides together, and then just like I mentioned before, we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch away on either side of this line. Once this is sewn together, we can cut right on that line that we drew, open them up, and square them up according to what the pattern says. And we're going to do this 7 more times because we're going to need 16 half square triangle units in all. take some time to cut all of these apart. Then while I have my rotary cutter out, I'm going to grab my Clearly Perfect slotted trimmers. I always get this messed up. So many words for the name of this thing, but it's a tool that's really helpful. For each one of these half square triangle units, I'm going to square them up to what the pattern says. And the way I do that is I put the dotted line that's directly underneath the measurement I'm trying to square up to exactly on my stitching line. And then I just clean up along the right and then across the top. And I do position my ruler so that that line is actually going at a diagonal. That way I don't have to move things around. This is all trimmed up and ready to be pressed. We're going to do that to the other 15. I do want to point out that if you wanted to get rid of your dog ears while you're doing this step, this particular tool does have little notches along the side that you could cut into just like that to get rid of your dog ears. I usually don't do that. I find it's a little bit easier just to clip them with a pair of scissors. This is why I square up all of my half square triangle units, because if I wouldn't have squared it up, all of this would have been left in my quilt, and obviously this much extra will totally change the size of my blocks and make my quilt come out a little wonky. It's a tedious process, but honestly, I feel like I get better results when I take the time to do this. Now that these are all trimmed, we just need to press them open and then we can start putting our block together. The pattern instructions do want us to press this towards fabric B, so I'm going to lay out my half square triangle unit so that fabric B is on top. I'm going to hold it with my finger, and I'm just going to bring my iron in and very gently push that fabric over towards fabric B. I want to be careful when I'm doing this that I'm not stretching or pulling on that seam at all, because that could cause my diagonal line to end up being a little wonky, and I want to keep it perfectly straight and make sure that the seam is coming to the corner on either side of that block. That's what's going to help preserve points in my block when I put this together. Just to make sure everything's nice and tidy, I'm going to come in with a pair of scissors and snip off these dog ears on all 16 of these. Step number 2 wants us to take 10 of these, and we're going to make 2 rows that look exactly the same. We're going to lay out 5 half square triangle units so that fabric D is pointing down and to the right, and we're going to take a seam in each one of these and press everything to the right. We're going to do that twice. I can be a little challenged when it comes to making sure that my pieces go in the right way. And so one of the ways that I like to do it is just lay out my row right here next to my sewing machine. I'll pick up the first 2 pieces, place them right sides together, scratch the ends all together. Then I'll take this to my sewing machine, sew a 1/4 of an inch, open it up, and then I grab the next piece and I just keep building onto that row. There's 1 row pieced, and there's my 2nd row pieced. For both of these rows, we're going to press the seams over to the right. So I'm just going to flip this over, and because it's now going in the opposite direction, I'm just going to give it a little tug, just so it's taut, and press everything towards the left. That way, when I lay it the direction it needs to go, the seams are going in the right direction. This is now your top and your bottom row of your block, or if you're looking at it from your direction, top and bottom. Either way, you have 2 rows done, and now we need to build the side rows that are going to go around our center block. To do that, I'm going to lay out 3 half square triangle units so that fabric B is pointing down and to the right, and we're going to build a sideways strip. So we're going to make these 2 units. This is where we're going to take our seam, and for all of these, we're going to press up towards this square. So just to make sure I'm doing this right, I'm going to rotate my mat 90 degrees because I can't sew up and down, but I can sew on the side. And then we're going to press this up towards the top. So I'm just going to finger press that, and I'll give it some heat. So now what you should have are 4 rows, 2 for the sides and 2 for the top and bottom, that will go together to frame your center square. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is because the orientation of those half square triangle units is going to be really important. You want to make sure on all of your rows that your background fabric is always in the upper left position. It's going to be really easy to accidentally do something like this, and then your block isn't going to look the way it's intended to look. The next step is going to have us use the stitch and flip method to make a half square triangle unit out of our fabric C and our fabric D fabrics. So what we're going to do is take fabric C and draw a line corner to corner on the wrong side of the fabric. Then we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch exactly on or immediately next to, just a thread next to, the line that we just drew. Now, the pattern says that you're going to cut a 1/4 inch away from where this stitch line was and discard what you cut away and keep the half square triangle unit. But that's a big piece of fabric and I like to save it. So I go about a 1/2 inch away from that line that I just stitched and I stitch another line. This way, when I take it to my cutting mat and I cut a 1/4 inch away from that line that I drew, I have a bonus half square triangle unit that is a really good size that I can use somewhere else. For this one, it does say that we're going to press the half square triangle unit down towards fabric D. So I've just given that a little bit of a finger press, and I'm going to come in and give it some heat. Now I'm going to take this half square triangle unit that I just made and I'm going to lay it right in the center of our block. This is what we're putting together. I'm going to make my middle row and then I'm going to secure the top and the bottom to the row. And the reason why I'm doing the middle row first is because I have 2 seams that I have to take here to make this middle row the same size as my top and bottom row. If I lay all my fabric out so that the raw edges are just touching one another, you can see that this middle row is not as narrow as the top or bottom row. And that's because I still have seams to take in that row that I don't have left in the top and bottom row. So the way I'm going to do this is just to make my middle row and then secure my top and bottoms. Now you do have some points that you don't want to lose when you're putting your rows onto your center square. And you could take your time to pin that if you would like, but what I like to do is just lay the half square triangle units so that they are faced up. And as I'm stitching, I am watching for this little X intersection where my threads from my seams have kind of met and come together. I'm going to make sure that my needle goes either directly through that or just a thread off to the right of it when I sew it onto my center square. And that's going to help make sure that I don't lose my points right here on the side. So once again, what I'm doing is taking this unit, laying it so that it's wrong side up on top of my square, and I'm going to stitch paying attention to where those half square triangle unit threads are coming together. The instructions say we're going to press this in towards the middle square. So I'm just going to finger press this. I'm not going to worry too much about a heat press just yet. And now I'm going to take the top row, flip it over so that it's laying on top of my middle row. And what should happen is these seams here should nest. I was trying to get my seams to nest and I just noticed I missed a pressing step on my top and bottom row. I thought that the pressing instructions told us to press everything in one direction, but what they actually wanted us to do is press the first one way and all of the other ones in opposite directions so that our seams will nest together nicely. So I'm just going to take a second to fix that. So the first seam goes off to the left and then all of the subsequent seams are still going off to the right. So I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to use this as a diagram because it was the same row. Okay. Now that my seams are nested correctly, I'm going to take my top row and I'm going to lay it on top of my main body of my block. And because I follow the pressing instructions, the seams right here should nest together quite nicely. And what I mean by nesting together is the seams are going in opposite directions. So I should be able to bump them up next to each other so that they're just kissing. When I'm feeling it with my finger and my thumb, I shouldn't feel a gap in between those two seams, nor should I feel them stacked on top of one another. I should feel them right up against one another. You can pin these if you don't want to lose your points. I am putting my pin through the point at the back and then the point on the other piece, and then just be really careful about feeding this through my machine. We're going to want to make sure that the fabric stays to the right of that X, not through it and not to the left. Then we'll bring it back over here and press it up with our hands. Now we're going to do that same thing down here. Our seams should be nesting, and if we sew this with the half square triangle units on top, we should have a good visual for making sure that our points are not lost. We're looking for that X where the threads intersect. Stay just to the right of it. And for this one, we're going to press it down towards that bottom row. So when I'm pressing my block after I've put it all together, I do like to press it out with my fingers and my hands first, just to make sure that all the seams are going in the right direction. And then I'll come in with my hot iron and I'll nudge or convince those seams to really go in the direction I want them to go. Now that I've got those seams kind of laying where they're supposed to go, I'm going to take my hands and just kind of pat this out, make sure that everything is nice and straight. Then I'm going to spritz this with some Best Press, and I'm going to come in with my iron one more time. This is really going to do a lot to help me get this block nice and flat. When I'm pressing this block, I do want to make sure that I'm not pushing the fabric anywhere. I want these lines and seams that I just sewed into the block to stay nice and straight. So just be careful that you're not stretching or pulling your fabric in any direction. When this block is all done, it should measure 10.5 inches square. So I'm going to take a very large square ruler and I'm going to put that 45-degree line right on top of the seam for this block in the corner, this block in the corner, and this in the middle. And if I have to fudge it anywhere, what's most important is that the blocks in opposite corner, that seam is right on that 45 diagonal. Nobody's going to really notice if this one's off a little bit. It's these that are going to matter because that's what you're going to see when it's sewn into the rest of the quilt. So this is my lovely block. I am quite impressed with how easy this went together. I'll tell you, when I looked at the pattern, I went, oh my gosh, all of those half square triangle units. But it really didn't take that long at all. There are definitely imperfections in my block. There are areas where I haven't kept all of my points. And I'll tell you, it's supposed to square up to 10.5 inches, but there's a couple of spots in mine where it came to like 10 3/8. I'm not going to take this block apart and redo it. I'm not going to start a new one. This is going to be plenty fine. When I sew this into the finishing pattern, those little areas that are not quite perfect, your eye isn't going to be drawn to them the way your eye might be drawn to them now. By the time you add in all of the other visual interest, the other blocks, the other fabrics, the quilting, and then you wash it and it gets that crinkle factor, nobody's going to notice that your points are off just a little bit. Enjoy the process. Don't stress about it being perfect. Now, that said, if what brings you joy is absolute perfection in your project, then by all means, rip the seams and try again, or cut some more fabric and start over. For me, this is good enough. That's block 1 for the Bliss quilt along. I'm super excited to be started on this new quilt top. Don't forget, next week on Saturday at 9 a.m., we will drop the video for block number 2. So make sure you come on back then. I'll see you in a week. Bye.